Star Trek has always taken on the contemporary political, social, and moral issues of the time that it was airing. From the original series episode of A Private Little War, which was an allegory of the Vietnam War period, to body autonomy and individuality in Star Trek's episode A Measure of a Man, to contemporary issues in this week's episode of Strange New Worlds. So sit back as I break down the legal as well as some of the great storytelling that was in this week's episode 2.2 at Astra Per Aspera. On this week's episode of Cine Presents Blerd Trek, coming to you now. Greetings, nerds. I'm Will Polk, host of Cine Presents Blerd Trek and co-host and producer of the Cine Nerd podcast with our host, Sarah Belmont. Thank you for joining me this week. As I noted earlier, I'm going to be talking about episode 2.2 of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, titled Ad Astra Per Aspera, which is Latin for To the Stars Through Difficulties, which sums up this episode beautifully because through hardships, Una has made her way to the stars, but will Starfleet continue to allow her to serve? Let me just say that this episode clearly had many, many layers to it. And, and as me, not only here as a reviewer, but also in my professional life, being a lawyer, and civil rights and constitutional law and civil liberties is something that has always been an area that has been near and dear to me. This episode reminds me of why I wanted to become a lawyer in the first place and how the law can be used not only as a force for good, but also how this episode shows how the law can be used for bad. And this episode demonstrates beautifully how Star Trek can tell a great courtroom drama, which is right up there with prior episodes of Star Trek, for example, Court Martial and The Measure of a Man and The Drumhead, and why Star Trek is always at its best when it has an episode with a clear voice and the message and the questions that it presents to its audience. And this episode leaves very little room to misinterpret the moral lesson that it's exploring. It's funny, you hear on social media and the internet sometimes that, saying modern Star Trek is woke or whatever the hell that means. But, when you think about it, I mean, what show were they watching growing up before as far as the original series and Next Generation, DS9, as far as Legacy Trek? Because those episodes and this episode clearly represents what we see in Star Trek and what Star Trek means to be. And at its core, always trying to present a better society and what we all aspire to be. So, hats off to the production team this week with this particular episode. Before I continue, would like to say, love to hear what you think of the episode. So be sure to leave a comment below, hit that like button, and help support our channel as we grow, and subscribe and hit that notification so you don't miss Cine Nerd Presents Blerd Trek or our regular show that drops each week. So turning to some of the technical aspects of the episode, this episode was directed by Valerie Weiss and written by Dana Horgan. I have to say it was well acted, well directed, and the story was crisp and clean as I noted before. Definitely had a very clear story, what it wanted to tell, and did not hold back in telling it. Performances this week were just top flight. Guest star Yeti Dabaki, who played Nira, the attorney who was defending Una, was just amazing. She, A game, loved the passion, really believable as far as the conviction that she conveyed in playing the role. Rebecca Romaine as Una, this was probably one of her best performances I've seen in Strange New Worlds. Brought the right amount of uh, you know, desperation as far as whenever she was learning the fate here in the plea deal, but also during the trial and sharing the persecution and things that she felt as an Illyrian on the Federation colony whenever she was growing up, and then wanting to escape. Made it really really believable, and I had to say I was very emotional during that final act of the uh, courtroom proceedings. I know our friends over at Trek Culture had some quibbles about the set and redressing the Federation headquarters set from Star Trek Discovery and using it here in Strange New Worlds. But in some regards, it was very fitting that they had redressed that set because, again, it just gets into the whole bigger theme of what we aspire Star Trek to be and Starfleet to be in the Federation, and and it's really put on trial as far as how they treat their citizens. In this case, do we live up to the best of our angels, or do we resort to fear and prejudice because of sins of the past, and deeds of the past, and so all that was on display in this episode. Other cool things about it, of course, the dress uniforms, updated them from the 60s. Loved it. I want one now. So, send me one if you're a tailor. Let me know. I'll get you my measurements. Also, wonderful shots of San Francisco as far as seeing Starfleet headquarters, the mess hall on the Enterprise, and all, and that set. So, love those technical aspects of the episode. This review is going to be a little bit more about some of the highlights, of course. Of course, it wasn't a lot of pew 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 action in the episode, but did have some great moments with a very heavy subject and even some moments of humor. But even in those moments of humor, it conveyed the overall theme as far as what this episode was really trying to share about stereotypes and prejudice. And jumping right into that, it was a very funny scene there in the mess hall as Ortegas and then Dr. Mbenga looked at Spock and Admiral Patak during that display, and really get into the stereotypes, because Ortegas was having a mocking, joking conversation about what she thought was going on, but then you had Mbenga sitting there who is familiar with Vulcans and their displays and stuff, because I believe, if I recall, he had an internship early on in his career whenever he was going through med school. He could pick up on those cues and things like that. And so, of course, when Spock does come over to the table and apologizes for the display, it was a humorous moment, but whenever Spock apologized for that display of emotion, again, it just shows how prejudice and stereotypes can fester and manifest themselves, and how it's important for us to really learn about other cultures and other things, because you may miss out on those contexts if you don't keep your mind open and learn about other cultures and other things. So that was a great, using humor in that moment, but also great Star Trek too, because it didn't beat you over the head with the lesson, but that the undercurrent of the story was there. Speaking of prejudice, lumping everyone who's genetically modified as bad, it was definitely on top of mind in this episode. And when you think about it, you look at the examination of La'an and the fact that she did have to finally admit under oath that she was a descendant of Khan Noonien Singh. Now, for fans, long-term fans of Star Trek, hearing Khan, of course, we know he's an augment, was one of the driving forces behind why the eugenics wars happened on Earth, and why genetic modification and engineering was banned on Earth after that, and how that ban not only carried forward on Earth's government, but made it into the Federation from that grew out of the Earth Starfleet and the other planets that did align to create the Federation in 22nd century. And we saw that during Enterprise. So we definitely we have that as well. And then, one of the things I'm hoping the series does carry forward with is seeing how the ramifications for La'an, disclosure about her ancestry, and how far does Starfleet go back as far as lineage, and also does the prejudice now sort of fall on her because of who her ancestor is. Just a quick thought I had about La'an, and why, after her testimony of actually going on the record that she was a descendant of Khan Noonien Singh, why we have a possible continuity error, or why Spock and Space Seed in the original series episode Space Seed didn't seem to recognize or remember Khan Noonien Singh whenever they discovered who he was after awakening him on the Botany Bay sleeper ship. Two thoughts. One, Spock may have been trying to just protect La'an by using the line, if you recall, records from that fragmentary period were fragmentary. So, and I paraphrase that, but essentially that was, uh, given that Earth was so chaotic during the eugenics wars, maybe he, even though he knew about Leon and all, he was just protecting her given the events of what transpired with Una. The second thought is that maybe because of what happened during Una's proceedings, maybe her testimony was sealed as far as on, and people were ordered not to discuss it, given that Starfleet clearly wanted to push things related to genetic modifications under the rug with how they handled Una's uh, reveal and outing herself. That maybe that was another reason why he did so in Space Seed. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that. So drop them in the comment box below as far as what your theories are, as far as why Spock didn't seem to remember who Khan Singh was in Space Seed. This episode, clearly was an allegory for a lot of things that we're seeing today, especially in treatment of our LGBTQ citizens and other people as well. It also did a great exploration of wanting to see do what's right, but really willing to bend the rules to do what is right. And Nira, makes that point with Admiral April whenever he was willing to break the Palm Directive to save those planets from calamity or whatever. But on the other hand, when it came to just genetic modification, he was very rigid and all. So great setup and everything with this episode. So as far as this turning to setup of the episode, we do see some flashbacks to Una when she was young, and referencing, we saw later the injury that she referenced on when she was a kid with her broken leg, and how it was an example of her genetic modifications that we first learned about in the first season in Ghost of Valeria, where she has the ability to fight off infections, and of course the whole thing of passing and those issues, and hiding who you are. She definitely would glow when it happened, and so you saw her parents, the fear and everything that would happen if one, if she glowed like that to help with her injury, but also clearly if they had gone to a traditional doctor, they would have realized that she's been genetically modified. Of course, as I noted earlier, we learned, and other series, from the original series to Prodigy, that due to the eugenics wars, Starfleet has, and later the Federation has adopted Earth's prohibitions against genetically modified people, and how ingrained over time, for good reason, because of the eugenics wars, it was the necessary need to have it there. But over time, that need of, and understanding what were the reason and rationale behind genetic modifications had morphed into a deeply ingrained prejudice against people who have been genetically modified in this utopian society. So that was at display as far as in this episode. Uh, Pike does gets Una's childhood friend, who's also Illyrian, and now a civil rights lawyer, to come represent her, and we learn about her history and why the animosity that she shared towards Una was really explored in the episode, and why at first she was very reluctant to help. But we do get that, and of course we do ultimately get that Una is cleared of the charges after she rejects the plea deal. And I love that from a legal standpoint. This poor young JAG officer here, he looks like he's fresh out of the academy, law school. And because of the rejection of the plea deal, Starfleet then amends the charges and brings the full disciplinary weight against Una because of who she is. So those are just the setup. So now I want to turn to the analysis of the episode itself, and look at it from not only from a dramatic standpoint, but also from a legal standpoint as well. As I noted before, this episode had so many layers to it, and because it does. I'm not going to get into every single thing, but as a lawyer, and I always enjoy a well-written TV show that uses legal processes, and I'm going to look at this episode from that aspect of the show this week with not only the resolution of the episode, not only from the dramatic escape hatch that we had there at the end, but also from a legal method to understand how this episode can withstand legal scrutiny as well. So, using a method that many people have probably heard called the IRAC method, which is, you have the issue, the rule, the analysis, and conclusion, and use points from the episode to highlight those points in that acronym. So, of course, the issue in this episode clearly is you had an Illyrian who cannot serve in Starfleet due to the extensive genetic modifications that were made to her. Of course, these genetic modifications were, in Una's case, were not voluntary. This was a cultural practice that her race engages in. So the rule in this case were two key two things that really come into play. It was of course, the regulations prohibiting that practice and allowing people to serve in the Starfleet, but also you had another rule, Starfleet's code on dealing with asylum, which and authorizing it, and it had these several elements for those people who were fleeing persecution and fearing for their safety due to their political and religious beliefs or their biology. And then Starfleet captains do have the discretion and to authorize asylum, which was confirmed by a tribunal or a designated authority. So that's the rules of the game that was set up in this case. From analysis here, from a legal standpoint, on the first point, it's pretty clear that the prosecution did have a very, very solid case, and that's why when Captain Patel was trying to encourage Una to take the deal, she really encouraged Una to take it. But of course, as the trial was developing and everything, we saw the evidence that was presented. Of course, the case against Captain April, which could cut both ways because he was a friendly witness and he made very good points. But as far as very clear that the regulation is very clear. But then Nero made a very good point on cross that you had some discretion there as far as you followed the rules in one case, but then in other cases you didn't. And because of basically impeaching Captain April's, Admiral April's, testimony there, the tribunal kicked it out. What was really, really cool, particularly with the second point, is how Nira used the Iraq method to get Una exonerated from these charges. And so, from the asylum, for me, it was just like amazing lawyering, and it's like, took me back to first year of law school, and and law professors should use this particular courtroom scene as a way to show how you can use the testimony to lay a foundation and then use the evidence to back up each element of the rules that you have to meet to have a person be granted asylum, at least in Starfleet and under Federation law. So here we did have the great, with each element, of course, she was fleeing persecution, and they fleshed all those things out as far as in her testimony. We did have Starfleet captain being able to grant asylum if finds that these conditions were met. And in this case, it goes back to Ghost of Valyria in the first season, where Captain Pike did refuse Una's offer resignation because he was like, no, I'm not going to take this. And so either consciously or if Captain Pike was aware of this regulation, clearly he's a well-trained captain and knows these regulations inside out. Maybe he was, even though at the time they didn't like explicitly say it, it was clear he was like, let's just not go down that road. He refused her resignation and essentially gave Una a safe harbor to be able to continue to serve in Starfleet. And then of course the tribunal itself was the designated authority here to be able to officially grant the asylum so that Una could continue to serve in Starfleet. So, um, the episode definitely did have, the technicality, which, Una did fleet, clearly acknowledge that. But the episode also took how we judges approach judicial power. And where here the court limited their review to the issue at hand, mainly because they had another law that frankly allowed them to not deal with the first issue that was present, which was Una was clearly genetically modified, and that is against the one law. But then you had another competing law that basically they allowed for them to rule under, and they left at basically the underlying regulation that Starfleet has in place. But they do recognize the fact that there needs to be an evaluation by Starfleet and by policymakers about, have we become too inflexible and interpreting that regulation to the place where we're allowing prejudice and other things to color how we enforce it. And so, of course, the court did not address that, but they did recognize that that line, that on the one hand, yes, we do need to have these rules in place about genetic modifications, because clearly we saw in Earth's past, in the Star Trek universe, what can happen when you allow for these types of things to go forth unregulated. But at the same time, we also need to recognize that each individual is a case by case basis, and we really need to look at it as well. And so that's why they kept it that way. And of course, down the line, there's other characters in Star Trek that where this has become an issue. But for the present case, they can only consider the defendant's motion here, which was to rule on the narrow issue at hand, and the trial court did grant Una asylum and acquitted her of the charges that she had against her. So this is totally consistent legally. Of course, do this many times where a law could be amended by policymakers. Sometimes they will strike down the law across the board. Sometimes they will just rule as the law applies to a particular individual. So we've seen this how broad or how narrow judicial power is utilized in Star Trek, we've seen in other episodes. For example, in The Measure of the Man, we did see the Federation Court overrule the prior acts of Cumberland, which basically allowed data to be the property of Starfleet, and they in that case ruled that that regulation was no longer valid, and data was indeed a sentient being. So this episode really cuts to the question of how the law can be used as a force for good, or it can be used to reinforce prejudices and stereotypes. We see that play out in our present day, and where the law can be used to protect and expand civil rights, with both courts and policy-making bodies such as Congress and legislatures passing things like the Civil Rights Act, or Levy v. Virginia, which struck down anti-miscegenation laws that prohibited interracial marriages. And we also had Obergefell decision that recognized same-sex marriage as the law of the land. But we also see situations where we can see prejudice and stereotypes being enacted into law, with some of the anti-transgender laws that we're seeing being debated and passed in the United States right now. Passed with Jim Crow laws, where we had by color of law and also color of custom, separate but equal water fountains and those kind of things being being put into place, and clearly they were not. And of course, court decisions like Brown v. Board of Education overruled those. Using the law is a good thing. And of course, another one that's very top of mind, especially a year ago, we had where courts have limited amount of choice in our country and put it back to the states, as far as with the Dobbs decision. So where you can end up with a hodgepodge of things. So we've seen how law can be used for good and bad. So again, Star Trek, this episode again shows how we have our Constitution and our laws in our present society even like in a future world of Star Trek, which does present a utopia, they are dealing with some, they're showing us how in a future society, how they're trying to deal with their prejudices and things that were, may have been, at least in this case, you had a law that was enacted for a good purpose, which was uh, preventing the rise of the next con scene. But over time, it became utilized as a bad purpose in order to that led to prejudice and keeping people from being able to live their best selves and fully serve. In the case of people who like Una, who through their cultural or biological reasons um, didn't have a choice. That's just how they are, and that's who they are. But now this law is being used against them to allow them to live their destiny. So this was an amazing episode in that regard, and definitely one that will is definitely go down as far as one of the top legal episodes of Star Trek, and really gets to the core of what Star Trek is about. Just a few honorable mentions on the legal side. You did have the on Nira and Hura and the whole concept of the fruit of the poison tree come into play, which is a true legal concept. Of course, Leon noted it from a Starfleet regulation as far as where it's a doctrine that prohibits the evidence that has been improperly or illegally obtained being inadmissible in court. And it came into play here where Leon was wondering if, because of her personal log, she was worried that someone had hacked into the system and used her log against Una. Of course, we later found out that Una actually just turned herself in. But not only did it come into play there, but also Uhura, who didn't have much to do in this episode, but did have a very important role there, where she was like, when La'an was trying to use her to give her an illegal order to look for personal logs to see who was the person who outed Una on the ship. Uhura recognized that no, I can't break the law here to help a better end to help Una, because at the end of the day, if she broke that law and that regulation, then at the end of the day, that information that they may have been able to obtain probably wouldn't been utilized in court. So, good, again, great episode as far as using legal concepts and stuff to for good and bad. This episode really spoke to me in so many ways, and I hope it spoke to you as well as a viewer, as we explored the many moral and political and ethical questions and legal questions that this episode presented, not only in the Star Trek universe, but also what lessons we can learn from this fictional universe and how can we apply it to our own. So, thank you for joining me on this latest episode of Scene and Nerd presents Blerd Trek. Follow our crew on Twitter at Scene and Nerd and at SNN Blerd Trek. Friend us on Facebook. Follow us on Instagram at scene_n_nerd. And our website, www.sceneandnerdpodcast.com. Our main show drops every Friday. And also, please be sure to rate, follow, comment on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, here on YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. Live long and prosper.